You've probably heard of the Christmas Truce of 1914, right? It's one of those incredible, almost unbelievable stories from the First World War, a moment of humanity right in the middle of all that madness. But the version we all think we know, this idea of a spontaneous Christmas miracle, well, that story has been polished over the years, and it kind of hides a much more complex and, honestly, a more fascinating reality.
So, what really happened? Was it just this sudden, magical burst of Christmas spirit that made enemies put down their guns and meet in no man's land for a single day of peace?
Yeah, the popular legend, the one we all love, it paints this picture of a single magical moment. Soldiers on both sides, just moved by the holiday, decide to stop fighting, trade gifts, and even play a little football. It's a beautiful story, but it's not the whole story.
The truth is, the truce wasn't just some random product of Christmas cheer. It was actually the culmination of a very unique set of circumstances, and in a lot of ways, it wasn't spontaneous at all. The seeds for this moment of peace had actually been planted months earlier.
To really get what happened, we have to look at the day-to-day reality of trench warfare in late 1914. Because long before the big Christmas truce, there were countless little truces happening every single day.
You see, soldiers on the front lines developed this unofficial system they called live and let live. As they settled into the grim rhythm of the trenches, they figured out that just looking the other way sometimes could bring a little bit of safety, a little bit of sanity to their lives. So mealtimes, those often became unspoken ceasefires. Patrols passing in the night would frequently just pretend they didn't see each other.
And you have to remember, before they were enemies to each other, both sides were fighting a much bigger, more immediate war against the weather. The water table in that part of Europe meant trenches were constantly flooding and collapsing. The mud was like quicksand. It could literally suck a man down. This shared misery created this strange, unspoken bond between them. So, you have this backdrop of daily, informal truces and a common enemy in the mud and the rain. Then, a few key things happened right around Christmas Eve that really set the stage for something much, much bigger.
First off, a ton of gifts started arriving from home. The British soldiers got these little brass boxes from Princess Mary, filled with tobacco and sweets. The Germans got a gift from the Kaiser, cigars or a pipe. And on top of that, you have all the packages from family, with plum puddings, chocolate, and thousands upon thousands of cigarettes. Morale went way up, but it also created a new problem. Where do you put all this stuff?
Then came the real Christmas gift. After weeks of miserable, non-stop rain, the sky finally cleared. The temperature dropped like a rock, and that whole sea of mud froze into a hard, solid surface. For the first time in a long time, it was actually possible to walk without sinking. The whole battlefield suddenly became quiet and still. Okay, so you've got guys with full bellies, they finally have dry feet, and there's this shared sense of holiday spirit in the air. The stage was perfectly set. And then, one side made a move that would change everything, and it started with a song drifting through the darkness. The German soldiers started putting these small, candlelit Christmas trees, or Tannenbäume, on the edges of their trenches. For the British soldiers staring across no man's land, it must have been an absolutely surreal sight. At first, they were suspicious, thinking it was some kind of trick, maybe setting them up for an attack. But then, they heard this incredible sound drifting across the frozen fields. It was the original Austrian carol, Silent Night. A British officer, Lieutenant Edward Hulse, decided they couldn't be outdone and ordered his men to respond with their own carols. Pretty soon, this singing competition turned into guys just shouting Christmas greetings back and forth. And then came the direct offers. German soldiers called out across the darkness, making a simple proposition for a Christmas ceasefire. In most sectors along the line, the deal was struck. And so on Christmas morning, under a bright, clear sky, the impossible happened. Soldiers cautiously climbed out of their trenches and walked into the space where they'd been trying to kill each other just hours before. The first order of business was grim, burying the dead who lay between the lines, sometimes even in joint services. But then, the tension just broke. They started trading their extra gifts, British beef for German uniform buttons, chocolate for beer. They shared photos, a German barber gave haircuts, and famously, footballs appeared, leading to kickabouts on the frozen, shell-pocked ground. And they were also just incredibly curious about each other. They discovered they were living in the same mud, under the same rain, and were equally tired of the war. This quote really captures that bewilderment they must have felt as they realized their so-called enemy believed they were fighting for the very same ideals. There were countless little moments of personal connection.
Lieutenant Hulse, the same officer who started the carol singing, met a German officer who returned a Victoria Cross medal and letters they'd found on a fallen British soldier. Hulse was so touched he gave the German his own silk scarf as a thank you.
But it's really important to remember, this didn't happen everywhere, and not everyone approved. When one Bavarian squad was thinking about meeting the British, a young corporal furiously shouted them down, disgusted by the idea. That corporal was Adolf Hitler, and his disapproval was a pretty stark preview of how the High Command would eventually react.
So if this incredible moment of shared humanity was possible, why was it a one-time event? Why did the Christmas Truce of 1914 never happen again?
Well, by Christmas of 1915, the war had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a young war. The introduction of chlorine gas, battles with hundreds of thousands of casualties, and Zeppelin raids on London had created this deep, bitter hatred that simply didn't exist in 1914.
The generals were absolutely horrified. They saw this fraternization as a complete breakdown of military discipline and a threat to the army's will to fight. So orders came down from the top: restart the war. In some places, snipers were sent in to deliberately break the peace. In others, artillery was ordered to fire on the trenches, forcing the machinery of war to grind over the human connections that had just formed.
And tragically, for many of the men who shook hands in no man's land, it was their last Christmas. Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse, the man who sang carols and traded his scarf, was killed just 3 months later while trying to save a wounded comrade. He was only 25.
In the end, the Christmas Truce wasn't a military event. It didn't change the outcome of the war. Its participants are remembered for a different kind of victory, a deeply personal one, that they achieved when they dared to believe, even for just a moment, that their shared humanity was more powerful than the conflict they were all trapped in.
And that leaves us with a question that echoes far beyond the trenches of 1914. It's a story that forces us to ask what it takes, even in the darkest of times, to recognize ourselves in the face of someone we've been told is our enemy.